The 7th of March, 1945. Remagen, Germany. On a high bluff above the Rhine River, American soldiers from the 9th Armored Division looked down through the smoke and winter haze and saw something they were not supposed to see. Across the river, framed between the dark stone towers of the Ludendorff Bridge, the steel span was still standing. For the German army, the Rhine was supposed to be the last great natural wall of the Reich. For the Allies, it was the barrier that had to be crossed before the final drive into Germany could begin. Every bridge was expected to be blown. Every crossing was expected to require boats, engineers, artillery, smoke screens, and thousands of men exposed in open water under German fire. But at Remagen, the impossible had not yet happened. The bridge was damaged, crowded, threatened, and wired for demolition, but it was still there. German troops, vehicles, civilians, and stragglers were pouring east across it, fleeing the American advance. On the West Bank, Lieutenant Carl H. Timmerman and the men of Company A, 27th Armored Infantry Battalion, were suddenly staring at a chance that had not been written into any careful Allied timetable. The central question was brutally simple. Could a handful of American infantrymen, tankers, and combat engineers seize a bridge that the German army should have destroyed before they ever reached it? Or would the Ludendorff Bridge vanish into the Rhine at the exact moment the first soldiers stepped onto its steel deck? The answer would turn a small German river town into one of the most consequential accidents of the final campaign in Europe, because Remagen was not planned as the great Allied crossing. It was not the centerpiece of the strategy. It was not where the enemy expected the decisive breach, and that is precisely why it became so dangerous. To understand why this bridge mattered so much, we have to step back into the first days of March 1945, when the Third Reich was collapsing west of the Rhine, but not yet defeated. The Battle of the Bulge had failed. German reserves had been drained. Allied armies were advancing across the Rhineland. Yet the German High Command still believed the Rhine could buy time. Time to regroup, time to delay, time to make the Allies pay dearly for every mile into the German interior. To understand why this bridge mattered so much, we have to step back into the first days of March 1945, when the Third Reich was collapsing west of the Rhine, but not yet defeated. The Battle of the Bulge had failed. German reserves had been drained. Allied armies were advancing across the Rhineland. Yet the German High Command still believed the Rhine could buy time. Time to regroup, time to delay, time to make the Allies pay dearly for every mile into the German interior. For centuries, the Rhine had been more than a river. It was a military boundary, a psychological line, and in the final months of World War II, it became the last defensible barrier between the Western Allies and the industrial heart of Germany. Behind it lay the Ruhr, the roads to central Germany, and the shrinking political core of Hitler's regime. If the Rhine held, the war might drag on. If it broke unexpectedly, the entire Western defense could unravel. Allied planners understood the scale of the obstacle. A forced crossing of the Rhine was not a simple river movement. It required bridging equipment, assault boats, smoke generators, anti-aircraft protection, artillery coordination, traffic control, and thousands of engineers working under fire. The major planned crossing, Operation Plunder, was expected to come farther north near Wessel under massive preparation and deliberate timing. Remagen was not supposed to steal the spotlight. It sat south of Bonn, where the Rhine ran through steep ground and difficult approaches. The eastern bank rose sharply toward the Erpeler Lay, a dark, rocky height that overlooked the bridge and gave defenders a commanding position. From a planner's perspective, it was awkward terrain. From an opportunist's perspective, it was a miracle waiting to be exploited. The Ludendorff Bridge itself was a relic of another war. Built during World War I as a railway bridge, it carried tracks across the Rhine between Remagen on the west bank and Erpel on the east. Its stone towers gave it the appearance of a medieval fortress grafted onto modern steel. By 1945, it was old, damaged by earlier bombing, and never designed for the relentless military traffic that was about to be forced across it. But the German demolition system was supposed to solve that problem. If the Americans reached Remagen, the bridge was to be destroyed. The structure had been prepared for demolition. Charges had been placed. Orders existed. Wires and firing circuits were part of the plan. On paper, the bridge should have been a trap, a tempting piece of steel that would disappear before it could be used. Yet the German defense of Remagen was already infected by the same disease consuming the rest of the Reich: confusion. Command authority was shifting, communications were failing, units were retreating through the town. Local commanders did not have the manpower they had been promised. Soldiers who should have defended the West Bank were melting into the eastbound traffic across the bridge. Captain Willy Bragi, responsible for the local defense, faced a situation that was deteriorating by the hour. The bridge was crowded with men and vehicles trying to escape. Reinforcements were uncertain. The tactical picture was unclear. The fear of destroying the bridge too early was real, because German units still needed it to withdraw. But waiting too long meant handing the Allies the very crossing the German High Command could not afford to lose. Into that confusion came Major Hans Scheller, sent to take command at Remagen on the morning of March 7. He arrived late, without the full support and communications the situation demanded. By the time he reached the bridge area, the Americans were already closing in. In theory, he now had authority. In practice, he had inherited a disaster already moving faster than his command system could respond. On the American side, the advance toward Remagen was part of Operation Lumberjack, the First Army's drive to clear the west bank of the Rhine. Brigadier General William M. Hoge commanded Combat Command B of the 9th Armored Division. Lieutenant Colonel Leonard Engemann led the task force pushing toward the town. Their assigned movement was not built around a dramatic bridge seizure. The Americans expected destruction, not opportunity. Then the scouts reached the high ground. The Rhine appeared below them, the town of Remagen lay in front of them, and the bridge that should have been twisted wreckage, stood across the water. General Hoge understood the danger, but he also understood the opportunity. Sending men onto the bridge could mean losing them in an explosion. The Germans might allow the first Americans to cross, then destroy the span behind them, cutting them off on the east bank. Tanks might be trapped, infantry might be isolated. A tactical miracle could become a tactical massacre. This was the kind of battlefield moment that can vanish in minutes. If the Americans paused, German engineers might finish the job. If they waited for perfect instructions, the bridge could be gone. If they attacked too slowly, the enemy could turn the approaches into a killing zone. The decision had to be made before the full chain of command could comfortably absorb what had just been discovered. But the alternative was worse. If the bridge was destroyed, the Allies would be forced back into the normal brutal mathematics of a Rhine crossing. Boats, pontoons, smoke, artillery, engineers exposed in the current. Casualties measured against water, steel, and time. Hoge made the decision that defined Remagen. The bridge had to be seized immediately. Lieutenant Karl Timmermann's men began moving through Remagen toward the western approach. They were not marching into a clear, orderly battlefield. They were moving through a town full of confusion. Scattered German resistance, civilians, wreckage, and the rising pressure of a demolition countdown no one could see. Ahead of them stood the bridge. Beneath it ran the Rhine. Somewhere inside the German system, someone was trying to make the entire structure disappear. As the Americans neared the bridge, an explosion tore through the western approach. Dirt, stone, and smoke burst into the air. The Germans had detonated a charge meant to crater the road and slow the assault. For a moment it seemed the expected destruction had begun, but when the smoke shifted, the bridge itself remained standing. That was the moment the battle changed from advance to gamble. The Americans could see German movement on the far side. They could see the towers. They could see the steel structure stretching across the river like a loaded gun aimed at both armies. Timmermann ordered the assault forward. Then came the larger blast. The bridge lifted. Smoke rolled across the span. The steel seemed to shudder under the force of the demolition. Men on both sides expected the structure to collapse into the Rhine. For the Germans, This was the moment the emergency plan was supposed to succeed. For the Americans, it was the moment they expected to see their impossible opportunity destroyed. But the bridge did not fall. The blast damaged the span, tore holes through sections of the decking, and left the structure weakened and dangerous. Yet the footpaths remained usable. The steel still crossed the river. The towers still stood. The Rhine was still bridged. In the seconds after the smoke cleared, the Americans realized that Germany's last natural barrier had just failed in the most unexpected way imaginable. Sergeant Alexander Drabik was among the first to race across, moving through fire, smoke, and the possibility that the bridge could explode beneath him at any second. Timmerman followed with his infantry. These were not men advancing across a secured military crossing. They were sprinting across a wounded structure, while German defenders, demolition circuits, machine guns, artillery, and pure chance all converged around them. Behind the assault infantry came the combat engineers, including Lieutenant Hugh B. Mott and men from the 9th Armored Engineer Battalion. Their job was not glamorous, but it was decisive. They had to find wires, cut cables, remove explosives, and keep the bridge alive long enough for the crossing to become irreversible. Every second mattered. Every charge left in place could turn success into catastrophe. The fight was not only on the bridge deck. German machine gun fire came from the towers and the far bank. American tanks fired to suppress defenders. Infantrymen pushed toward the east bank and into the tunnel area beneath the Erpeler Lay. German soldiers and civilians crowded in the tunnel confronted the collapse of the old order in physical form. The Americans had crossed the Rhine before the bridge could be destroyed. Captain Bratches and Captain Karl Friesenhahn, the German engineer officer associated with the demolition effort, were caught in the chaos. The bridge had been prepared, the charges had been attempted, and yet the main result had failed. Whether because of damaged circuits, the effects of combat, inadequate explosive arrangements, or battlefield confusion, the decisive fact was visible to everyone on the riverbank. The Ludendorff Bridge remained in American hands. Once the first men reached the east bank, Remagen stopped being a local action and became a strategic emergency. The Allies suddenly possessed a bridgehead across the Rhine. The First Army reacted with speed. General Courtney Hodges moved to reinforce the crossing. Omar Bradley and Dwight D. Eisenhower approved exploitation of the unexpected breach. What had begun as a battlefield surprise became a new operational axis into Germany. The Germans understood the danger just as clearly. If the Americans could build strength east of the Rhine, the river line would no longer function as a shield. A bridgehead at Remagen threatened to pull German forces away from other sectors, disrupt plans for defense, and accelerate the collapse of the Western Front. The Reich had not merely lost a bridge, it had lost control over the timing of the final campaign. For the next 10 days, Remagen became one of the most heavily contested pieces of infrastructure in Europe. The bridge was no longer just a bridge. It was a funnel through which men, tanks, artillery, ammunition, fuel, engineers, and command urgency poured into Germany. It was also a target that the German military became desperate to destroy by any means still available. German artillery struck the bridge area. Luftwaffe aircraft attacked. V-weapons were fired toward the crossing. Floating mines and explosive devices threatened the river. Special swimmers were sent against the crossings. Every method reflected the same reality. Once the first American troops were across, destroying the bridge was no longer enough. The Germans now had to destroy the bridgehead. American engineers worked under conditions that were almost impossible to sustain. The Ludendorff Bridge was damaged, overloaded, and under attack. Its rails and decking had to be adapted for military traffic. Temporary bridges had to be built nearby. Anti-aircraft defenses had to be concentrated around the crossing. River obstacles, mines, and swimmers had to be anticipated. Traffic had to move across a structure that could fail without warning. The bridge became a one-way artery into the Reich, but a fragile one. Vehicles had to move carefully. Repairs continued, while the war moved over the heads of the men doing the work. Engineers were not simply maintaining steel. They were holding open a wound in Germany's last defensive line. This is the overlooked factor in the story of Remagen. The bridge was captured by courage, but it was exploited by engineering. Infantry could seize the far bank, tanks could suppress the towers, commanders could order divisions forward. But without combat engineers working through fire, darkness, damaged steel, fast water, and impossible deadlines, Remagen would have remained a dramatic raid instead of a strategic breach. The bridgehead expanded. American units pushed into the rough ground east of the Rhine, fighting to clear German observation and artillery positions that threatened the crossing. The terrain was difficult, compartmented, and dangerous. The Germans counterattacked fiercely. But the longer the Americans held, the more the meaning of Remagen changed. What had been a gamble became a fact on the map. Within days, the Allied command was no longer asking whether Remagen could be held. It was asking how much force could be pushed through it, how quickly temporary crossings could reinforce it, and how the unexpected lodgment could be integrated into the broader assault into Germany. Eisenhower's broad front strategy had found exactly the kind of enemy weakness it was designed to exploit. For Hitler, the loss of the bridge was intolerable. A regime built on punishment and denial searched immediately for scapegoats. German officers connected to the failure at Remagen were subjected to harsh military proceedings, and several were executed. But executions could not change the battlefield. The Americans were already east of the Rhine. The bridgehead existed. The river line had been broken. Then, on March 17, the Ludendorff Bridge finally collapsed. The timing was tragic, but strategically too late. Around 200 American engineers and workers were on or near the structure when the weakened bridge gave way. Steel tore apart. The span dropped into the Rhine. 28 soldiers were killed and many more were injured. The bridge that had survived German demolition, artillery, bombing, traffic, and emergency repairs finally surrendered to accumulated damage and strain. But by then, the bridge had already done its job. The Americans had established a deep foothold on the eastern bank. Temporary bridges and ferries were operating. Troops and equipment had crossed. The German effort to restore the Rhine as an unbroken defensive barrier had failed. The collapse of the Ludendorff Bridge was a disaster for the men caught on it, but it was not a reversal of the strategic outcome. That is the bitter paradox of Remagen. The Germans eventually destroyed the bridge, but they destroyed it too late. The physical span fell into the Rhine, yet the operational bridge it had created, the American bridgehead inside Germany, remained. The steel died after its military purpose had already been fulfilled. The capture of Remagen forced German commanders to respond to a crisis south of the main expected crossing area. It gave the Allies a real crossing before Operation Plunder. It disrupted assumptions, accelerated planning, and opened a route into the German interior. More importantly, it proved that the German army could no longer reliably control even its most vital demolition points under pressure. For the American soldiers who crossed first, Remagen was not an abstract strategic event. It was a sprint across damaged steel under the threat of sudden death. For Timmerman, Drabick, Mott, and the engineers cutting wires and clearing charges, the story was measured in seconds, not campaign maps. They did not know whether history would remember them. They only knew the bridge was standing and that someone had to run. The German failure at Remagen was not a single failure. It was a chain of failures. Command confusion, delayed authority, inadequate local strength, competing priorities, demolition complications, combat disruption, and the American willingness to exploit an opening instantly. The bridge did not survive because the German army ignored it. It survived because, at the decisive moment, a system under collapse could not act fast enough. And that is why the Ludendorff Bridge became more than a crossing. It became a symbol of the final phase of the war in the West, a moment when German defenses still looked formidable on paper, but were cracking under the speed, aggression, and improvisation of Allied arms. The Rhine was supposed to buy time. At Remagen, it lost time. When the bridge fell on March 17, the image was almost poetic. Twisted steel collapsing into the river it had conquered for 10 days. But the real story had already moved east. American divisions were across. Engineers had built alternatives. The final advance into Germany was no longer waiting on the West Bank. Remagen did not single-handedly end the war. No honest account should claim that. The Third Reich was already collapsing under pressure from west and east, but Remagen changed the tempo. It turned a planned crossing campaign into an immediate breach. It forced the enemy to react. It gave the Allies a foothold where the Germans had expected a barrier. In the end, the Ludendorff Bridge was not remembered because it stood forever. It was remembered because it stood just long enough for a lieutenant to order his men forward, long enough for a sergeant to reach the far bank, long enough for engineers to cut the wires, long enough for tanks, infantry, artillery, and history itself to cross the Rhine. Germany failed to destroy the bridge when destruction still mattered. And in war, sometimes that is the entire difference between a barrier and a doorway.